The morning mist hung thick over Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, as Major Robert Anderson peered through his spyglass from the ramparts of Fort Sumter. The fortress, perched on an artificial island 3 miles from Charleston's bustling waterfront, had become the eye of a political hurricane that threatened to tear the United States apart. Anderson, a career soldier from Kentucky with graying temples and weathered hands, knew that his small garrison of fewer than 90 men stood at the precipice of history. The fort itself was an impressive sight, a 5-sided masonry fortress with walls rising 50 feet above the harbor's waters. Construction had begun in 1829 as part of America's coastal defense system, but now it represented something far more symbolic. To the federal government, it was sovereign territory that must be held. To the newly formed Confederate States of America, it was a foreign occupation on sacred Southern soil. Anderson's second-in-command, Captain Abner Doubleday, approached with the morning reports clutched in his calloused hands. The two men had served together for years, their friendship forged in the crucible of military service along the frontier. Doubleday, a tall New Yorker with piercing blue eyes and an uncompromising sense of duty, had watched the political situation deteriorate with growing alarm. "Sir, our supplies are critically low," Doubleday reported, his voice carrying across the courtyard where soldiers were already beginning their morning drills. "We have perhaps 6 weeks of provisions remaining, and President Lincoln's relief expedition is still nowhere to be seen." The relief expedition had become a source of intense speculation and anxiety. Abraham Lincoln, sworn into office just weeks earlier, faced an impossible dilemma. Resupplying Fort Sumter might provoke the very war he hoped to avoid, yet abandoning the fortress would legitimize secession and potentially doom the Union. According to contemporary accounts from the New York Tribune, Lincoln had spent sleepless nights in the White House, consulting with his cabinet and military advisors about the Fort Sumter crisis. From the harbor came the sound of hammering and construction. The Confederates were strengthening their positions daily. Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and the floating battery all bristled with artillery pieces aimed directly at Anderson's small command. General Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard, the dapper Louisiana Creole who commanded Confederate forces in Charleston, had been Anderson's student at West Point. Now teacher and pupil found themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. The irony was not lost on Anderson as he watched Confederate flags flutter in the morning breeze. South Carolina had been the first state to secede, declaring its independence on December 20th, 1860. 6 more states had followed, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Charleston, with its proud traditions and fierce independence, had become the spiritual heart of the rebellion. As the sun climbed higher, Anderson could see crowds gathering along the Charleston waterfront. Citizens peered through telescopes and climbed to rooftops, sensing that something momentous was approaching. The tension was palpable, like the electric charge in the air before a thunderstorm. Women in their finest dresses promenaded along the harbor walk, while men in military uniforms gestured excitedly toward the fort. Anderson closed his spyglass with a sharp click. Whatever came next, he knew that his decisions in the coming hours would echo through American history. The fate of the Union itself might well depend on how he and his small garrison responded to the gathering storm. The afternoon of April 11th brought with it a small boat flying a white flag of truce. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., a distinguished South Carolina politician and former United States Senator, stepped onto Fort Sumter's wharf with the bearing of a man carrying the weight of history. Beside him walked Captain Stephen Dill Lee, a young West Point graduate whose family had deep roots in Virginia's plantation aristocracy. Major Anderson received the Confederate delegation in his modest quarters, where maps of the harbor covered every available surface. The room was spartanly furnished, a simple wooden desk, several chairs, and a portrait of George Washington that seemed to watch over the proceedings with solemn eyes. Through the single window, the men could see Charleston's church spires piercing the afternoon sky. "Major Anderson," Colonel Chestnut began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the Carolina Low Country. "I bear a communication from General Beauregard." He produced a sealed envelope from his coat pocket, the wax bearing the official seal of the Confederate States. "The General demands the evacuation of Fort Sumter. You have 1 hour to consider your response." Anderson's weathered hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and read the ultimatum. The letter was courteous but firm. Surrender the fort immediately or face the consequences. Behind the diplomatic language lay an unmistakable threat. Comply or be bombarded into submission. Captain Doubleday, standing at attention near the doorway, felt his jaw tighten. The ultimatum represented everything he despised about the rebellion, the arrogant assumption that federal authority could be brushed aside by state governments acting unilaterally. As a native of New York, Doubleday had witnessed the Union's growing pains firsthand, but he believed deeply in the concept of perpetual union that the founders had envisioned. "Gentlemen," Anderson finally replied, folding the letter carefully, "I cannot and will not surrender this fort. It has been entrusted to my care by the government of the United States, and I shall defend it to the best of my ability." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had made peace with his decision. Colonel Chestnut nodded gravely. He had expected this response, though he had hoped for a different outcome. As a former senator, he understood the terrible momentum that was building toward armed conflict. "In that case, Major, I must inform you that General Beauregard will open fire upon this fort within the hour, unless you reconsider." The Confederate delegation departed as solemnly as they had arrived, their boat cutting through the choppy harbor waters toward Charleston. Anderson watched them go, then called his officers together for what might be their final council of war. The fort's enlisted men, sensing the gravity of the moment, went about their duties with unusual quiet. As evening approached, Anderson walked the fort's perimeter, checking gun positions and speaking quietly with his soldiers. These men, artillerists, engineers, and laborers, represented the old regular army, professional soldiers who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies. Many were immigrants who had found purpose and belonging in military service. Now they found themselves manning the ramparts of what might become the last federal stronghold in South Carolina. The lights of Charleston twinkled in the distance like earthbound stars, while around the harbor, Confederate campfires dotted the shoreline. According to dispatches published in the Charleston Mercury, thousands of spectators had gathered to witness what many believed would be the beginning of Southern independence. Hotel balconies overlooking the harbor commanded premium prices, and families packed picnic baskets as if preparing for a grand entertainment. Anderson retired to his quarters as midnight approached, knowing that sleep would be impossible. Through his window, he could see the Confederate positions illuminated by torches and lanterns. Somewhere in the darkness, General Beauregard was making his final preparations. The two men, teacher and student north and south, would soon test their respective convictions with shot and shell. As the clock struck 12, Anderson knelt beside his narrow bed and offered a prayer for guidance. He had served his country faithfully for over 30 years, through the Second Seminole War and the Mexican-American War. Never had duty demanded such a terrible price. When he finally extinguished his lamp, the major lay in darkness, listening to the sound of waves lapping against the fort's stone walls and waiting for the dawn. At 4:30 in the morning of April 12, 1861, Captain George Sears James of the Confederate Artillery adjusted the elevation of his mortar at Fort Johnson. The pre-dawn darkness was broken only by the flickering torches that illuminated the gun positions around Charleston Harbor. James, a former United States Army officer who had resigned his commission to join the Confederate cause, checked his pocket watch one final time. General Beauregard had given the order. If Fort Sumter did not surrender by 4 o'clock in the morning, the bombardment would commence. The deadline had passed, and now the responsibility fell to James to fire the signal shot that would begin hostilities. His hands were steady as he applied the friction primer to the mortar's touch hole, but his heart raced with the knowledge that this single act might ignite a war between brothers. The mortar's report echoed across Charleston Harbor like thunder, and the shell traced a perfect arc through the dark sky before exploding directly over Fort Sumter. The war had begun. Major Anderson, who had been awake for hours, felt the concussion shake the fort's walls. Through his window, he could see the flash of artillery pieces lighting up the Confederate positions like deadly fireflies. Captain Doubleday rushed to his commander's quarters, finding Anderson already dressed and reaching for his sword. "They're firing from every position, sir," Doubleday reported, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, the Iron Battery, and the Floating Battery are all engaged. We're completely surrounded." Anderson nodded grimly as another shell burst overhead, raining fragments down on the fort's parade ground. The bombardment had begun in earnest, with Confederate gunners firing from positions that commanded every approach to Fort Sumter. The fortress, designed to protect Charleston from seaborne attack, now found itself the target of shore-based artillery firing from multiple directions. The Federal garrison sprang into action with the precision of well-trained soldiers. Sergeants bellowed orders as gun crews raced to their positions, while others sought cover in the fort's casemates, the protective chambers built into the walls. The sound of Confederate artillery was almost continuous now, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the artificial island. Sergeant John Carmody, an Irish immigrant who had served with Anderson since the Mexican War, supervised the loading of Fort Sumter's guns. The fortress mounted 60 pieces of artillery, but many were positioned on the upper tier where Anderson's men would be exposed to enemy fire. The major had made the difficult decision to limit their response to the protected guns in the lower casemates. As dawn broke over Charleston Harbor, the scope of the Confederate preparation became clear. According to reports later published in the Charleston Courier, over 3,000 shots would be fired at Fort Sumter during the 34-hour bombardment. The Confederates had positioned artillery in a ring around the harbor, creating a crossfire that made it impossible for the Federal garrison to return effective fire. Captain Doubleday personally sighted the first return shot from Fort Sumter, a 32-pound cannonball aimed at the Iron Battery on Cummings Point. The shot fell short, sending up a geyser of water and sand, but it announced to Charleston and the world that the Federal garrison would not surrender without a fight. The bombardment continued throughout the morning as curious spectators gathered on Charleston's rooftops and waterfront promenades. Ladies in their finest dresses held parasols against the morning sun, while gentlemen passed telescopes back and forth, commenting on the accuracy of the Confederate gunners. The atmosphere was almost festive, with vendors selling refreshments and children playing at being soldiers. Inside Fort Sumter, the reality was far grimmer. Confederate shells crashed into the walls with monotonous regularity, sending clouds of brick dust and masonry fragments flying through the air. The fort's wooden barracks caught fire repeatedly, forcing soldiers to abandon their bombardment duties to fight the flames. Smoke from burning timbers mixed with gunpowder to create a choking haze that filled the casemates. Anderson moved constantly among his men, offering encouragement and checking on the wounded. Miraculously, no one had been killed in the first hours of bombardment, though several soldiers had been injured by flying debris. The major's calm demeanor under fire inspired confidence in his garrison, even as the situation grew increasingly desperate. As the sun reached its zenith, Anderson realized that his ammunition supply was critically low. The fort had not been provisioned for a siege, and each shot fired in return depleted their limited stores. The Confederate bombardment showed no signs of slackening, and relief seemed increasingly unlikely. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Sumter's smoking ramparts as Confederate artillery continued their relentless bombardment. Captain Doubleday wiped sweat and grime from his forehead as he supervised the gun crews in the sweltering casemates. The temperature inside the protective chambers had risen to nearly unbearable levels, with the combination of April heat, gunpowder smoke, and the exertion of constantly manning the guns. Sergeant Carmody called out ranges and bearings to his gun crew as they loaded another shot for the 42-pounder Columbiads. The massive cannon, one of the most powerful guns in the fort's arsenal, could throw its heavy shot nearly 3 miles, but accuracy was nearly impossible with the constant vibration from incoming Confederate shells. Every few minutes, another enemy round would crash into the fort's walls, sending showers of brick and mortar cascading down on the Federal defenders. "Sergeant!" Private John Thompson, a young soldier from Pennsylvania, pointed toward the officers' quarters where smoke was beginning to pour from the windows. "The barracks are on fire again, sir!" This was the third major fire of the day. Confederate hotshot, cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces, were designed specifically to start fires in wooden structures. The fort's barracks, constructed primarily of timber, proved particularly vulnerable to this type of ammunition. Anderson had ordered his men to strip the roofs of inflammable materials, but the wooden framework continued to catch fire with alarming regularity. Major Anderson himself led the firefighting efforts, wielding buckets alongside his enlisted men. Water was precious in the fortress. Their supply came from rainwater collected in cisterns, and the Confederate bombardment had damaged several of the collection systems. Each bucket of water used to fight fires was water that could not be used for drinking or cooking. Dr. Samuel Crawford, the fort's surgeon, and one of the few officers who had not seen combat before, moved among the defenders treating minor injuries. Most wounds came from flying masonry fragments, though the intense heat and smoke inhalation were taking their toll on everyone. Crawford, a scholarly man from Philadelphia, found himself admiring the quiet courage of the enlisted men who continued their duties despite the obvious danger. As reported in contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the bombardment had attracted attention throughout the South and beyond. Telegraph lines carried news of the attack across the continent, while newspaper correspondents positioned themselves at strategic points around Charleston Harbor to witness history in the making. The fate of Fort Sumter had become a symbol for the larger question of whether the United States would survive as a single nation. Inside the fort, ammunition was becoming critically low. Anderson gathered his officers in the relatively protected Sally Port to assess their situation. Captain Doubleday, his uniform torn and blackened with gunpowder residue, reported that they had perhaps 50 rounds remaining for their serviceable guns. Captain John Gray Foster, the fort's engineer officer, estimated that the walls could withstand perhaps another day of bombardment before structural damage became critical. "Gentlemen," Anderson said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crash of incoming shells, "we must face the reality of our situation. We cannot hold out indefinitely, and President Lincoln's relief expedition appears to have been delayed or turned back." Unknown to Anderson, the relief expedition under Captain Gustavus Vasa Fox had indeed attempted to reach Fort Sumter, but had been prevented by rough seas and the strength of Confederate positions. The supply ships remained outside Charleston Harbor, unable to run the gauntlet of enemy artillery that now commanded every approach to the fort. As evening approached, the Confederate fire slackened somewhat, though it never ceased entirely. General Beauregard maintained enough pressure to prevent the Federal garrison from making repairs or reorganizing their defense. The orange glow of fires within the fort could be seen from Charleston, where crowds continued to gather despite the late hour. Private Thompson, the young Pennsylvanian who had spotted the first fire, found himself assigned to watch duty on the ramparts. Despite the danger, he was awed by the spectacle surrounding him. The entire harbor seemed to sparkle with muzzle flashes, while Charleston's gaslights twinkled in the distance like a galaxy of stars. He had joined the army seeking adventure, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of being under constant bombardment. Captain Doubleday made his rounds of the gun positions, checking on his men and assessing their ammunition supplies. The professional soldiers under his command had performed magnificently, maintaining discipline and good humor despite their desperate situation. These men represented the best traditions of the old regular army, steady, reliable, and utterly devoted to duty. As midnight approached, Anderson stood alone on the ramparts, looking out over the darkened harbor. Confederate campfires dotted the shoreline, and the occasional flash of a night gun reminded him that the siege continued. Somewhere in the darkness, ships flew the flag he had sworn to defend, but they might as well have been on the other side of the world. The major knew that another day of bombardment would likely force his surrender. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his men were weary beyond measure, and the fort's structural integrity was questionable. Yet he also knew that each hour Fort Sumter continued to fly. The Stars and Stripes was an hour that demonstrated federal determination to preserve the Union. Dawn of April 13th brought no respite for Fort Sumter's beleaguered garrison. The Confederate bombardment resumed with renewed intensity, as General Beauregard's gunners had used the partial lull of night to reposition their artillery and bring up fresh ammunition. Major Anderson, who had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, awoke to the familiar thunder of enemy guns and the crash of masonry falling in the parade ground. The fort's appearance had changed dramatically since the bombardment began. What had once been a pristine masonry fortress now resembled a battered ruin. Chunks of the outer wall lay scattered across the courtyard, while holes gaped in the officers' quarters and enlisted men's barracks. Most critically, the flagstaff had been struck multiple times, though each time the garrison had managed to re-raise the Stars and Stripes on a makeshift pole. Sergeant Carmody approached Captain Doubleday with grim news. "Sir, we've got maybe 20 rounds left for the guns that are still serviceable. The 32-pounders in casemate number 5 took a direct hit during the night. The carriage is completely destroyed." Doubleday nodded wearily. He had been awake most of the night, moving from position to position, encouraging the men and directing what little return fire they could manage. His uniform was singed in several places from fighting fires, and his hands were raw from handling the rough hemp ropes used to haul cannonballs and powder charges. The most serious crisis came mid-morning when a Confederate shot struck the fort's main magazine. Fortunately, Anderson had ordered most of the gunpowder moved to safer positions early in the bombardment, but the explosion sent a pillar of smoke and debris high into the air. The concussion was felt throughout the fort, and for a moment, the Confederate guns fell silent as enemy observers tried to determine if Fort Sumter had been destroyed. Dr. Crawford rushed to treat several men who had been knocked unconscious by the blast. Private Thompson, the young Pennsylvanian, suffered a severe concussion, but insisted on returning to his post. The surgeon was amazed by the resilience of the garrison. Men who should have been demoralized by 30 hours of constant bombardment continued to perform their duties with quiet professionalism. According to accounts published in the Richmond Examiner, Confederate commanders were growing frustrated by the fort's stubborn resistance. They had expected a quick surrender once the bombardment began, but the Federal garrison showed no signs of capitulation. General Beauregard consulted with his staff about the possibility of launching an amphibious assault, though the approaching rough weather made such an operation increasingly risky. The weather was indeed deteriorating. Dark clouds gathered over Charleston Harbor, and the wind began to pick up, causing the Confederate shots to scatter more widely. For Anderson's men, this was both blessing and curse. The less accurate enemy fire gave them brief respites, but the rising wind also made their own limited return fire even more ineffective. Captain Foster, the engineer officer, reported that the fort's structural integrity was reaching critical levels. Several of the casemates showed dangerous cracks, and the outer wall had been breached in multiple places. More ominously, fires continued to break out throughout the wooden structures inside the fortress, and their limited water supply was nearly exhausted. As afternoon wore on, Anderson made the rounds of his diminished garrison. Many of his men showed signs of exhaustion, dark circles under their eyes, hands that trembled slightly from fatigue, and the 1,000-yard stare that comes from prolonged exposure to combat. Yet their morale remained surprisingly high. These professional soldiers took pride in their ability to withstand whatever the enemy could throw at them. Private Michael O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had served with Anderson in Mexico, tended the fort's colors despite repeated Confederate attempts to shoot down the flag. Each time enemy fire brought down the stars and stripes, O'Brien would venture into the open parade, ground to raise them again. His devotion to the flag had become legendary among the garrison, and his fellow soldiers took inspiration from his quiet courage. The afternoon brought a brief lull in the bombardment, during which Anderson called his officers together for what might be their final conference. They met in the damaged Sally Port, the only space in the fort that offered reasonable protection from the intermittent enemy fire. Captain Doubleday, Captain Foster, Dr. Crawford, and the few remaining officers gathered around their commander. "Gentlemen," Anderson began, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the sound of artillery, "our situation has become untenable. We have perhaps a dozen rounds of ammunition remaining. Our water supply is critically low, and the fort's structure is compromised. I believe we must seriously consider surrender." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. These men had served together for months, isolated in their island fortress, while the country tore itself apart around them. The thought of surrender was bitter, but they were soldiers first, and soldiers understood the mathematics of warfare. Captain Doubleday was the first to speak. "Sir, if we must surrender, we should demand the honors of war. We've fought honorably and deserve to march out with our weapons and colors." Anderson nodded. The honors of war were important, not just for the garrison's pride, but for the symbolic message they would send. If they surrendered honorably, it would demonstrate that Federal forces had not been defeated by superior Confederate arms, but had simply been overwhelmed by impossible odds. As evening approached, the Confederate fire resumed with mechanical regularity. Anderson knew that this would likely be Fort Sumter's last night under the Federal flag. The morning of April 14th, 1861, dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds hanging low over Charleston Harbor. The Confederate bombardment had continued sporadically through the night, though with less intensity than during the peak of the assault. Major Anderson stood in the ruins of what had been his quarters, surveying the devastation that 36 hours of constant artillery fire had wrought upon Fort Sumter. The fortress that had once been the pride of Charleston's harbor defenses was now a smoking ruin. Gaping holes marred the outer walls, the officers' quarters were gutted by fire, and debris from collapsed structures littered the parade ground. Most critically, the main flagstaff had been shot away entirely, leaving the garrison to fly their colors from a makeshift pole cobbled together from broken timbers. Sergeant Carmody approached his commander with the final ammunition count. "Sir, we have 6 rounds remaining for the 42-pounder, and that's all. The other guns are either dismounted or out of ammunition entirely." Anderson received this news with the stoic acceptance of a professional soldier who had always known this moment would come. Around him, his men continued their duties with the same quiet professionalism they had shown throughout the bombardment, but exhaustion was evident in every face. Many had not slept for more than a few minutes at a time in nearly 2 days, sustained only by determination and military discipline. The fort's surgeon, Dr. Crawford, reported that while they had been miraculously fortunate in avoiding fatalities, several men were suffering from serious injuries and smoke inhalation. Their water supply was down to less than a day's ration, and the constant fires had consumed most of their food stores. More critically, the structural damage to the fort was becoming dangerous. Sections of the wall were in danger of collapse, and the remaining casemates offered questionable protection. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, a Confederate shell struck the remains of the fort's flagstaff, bringing down the stars and stripes once again. Private O'Brien, the Irish immigrant who had become the unofficial guardian of the colors, rushed into the open courtyard despite the continuing bombardment. As he bent to retrieve the fallen flag, another enemy round exploded nearby, and O'Brien collapsed. Dr. Crawford and several soldiers rushed to the fallen man's aid. O'Brien was unconscious but breathing, blood flowing from a head wound caused by flying masonry. As they carried him to the makeshift hospital in one of the remaining intact casemates, Anderson made his decision. He could not ask his men to sacrifice their lives for a position that could no longer be defended. Captain Doubleday found his commander standing beside the damaged flagstaff, the fallen colors clutched in his weathered hands. "Abner," Anderson said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of Confederate guns, "we must surrender. I will not see these brave men killed for a symbol, however precious that symbol may be." The decision once made brought a strange sense of relief. Anderson called for a white flag to be displayed, and gradually the Confederate bombardment ceased. The silence that followed seemed almost unnatural after 36 hours of continuous artillery fire. Across the harbor, church bells began to ring in Charleston, celebrating what the city's residents saw as the first victory of Southern independence. Within an hour, a boat flying a white flag of truce approached Fort Sumter's wharf. General Beauregard's aide-de-camp, Colonel Miles, stepped onto the dock accompanied by several other Confederate officers. Anderson met them at the Sally Port, still wearing his battered uniform but carrying himself with the dignity befitting a United States officer. The surrender negotiations were conducted with the courtesy that marked relations between professional soldiers, even in civil war. According to contemporary accounts from the Charleston Mercury, General Beauregard had specifically instructed his representatives to treat the federal garrison with respect, acknowledging their brave defense of an untenable position. Anderson's primary concern was securing honorable terms for his men. He demanded the right to salute his flag, to march out with arms and personal property, and to be transported to a northern port aboard a vessel of his choosing. The Confederates, flush with victory and eager to demonstrate their magnanimity, agreed to these terms without significant objection. As the formal surrender documents were prepared, Anderson walked among his men one final time as their commanding officer. These soldiers, regular Army professionals who had enlisted to serve their country, had performed magnificently under impossible circumstances. Not one man had shown cowardice, and their disciplined response to the Confederate bombardment had earned the respect even of their enemies. Private Thompson, the young Pennsylvanian who had spotted the first fire, approached his commander with tears in his eyes. "Sir," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "we're sorry we couldn't hold the fort." Anderson placed a paternal hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "Son," he replied, "you and your comrades have nothing to apologize for. You have served with honor, and your country will remember what you've done here." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the harbor, preparations began for the formal surrender ceremony scheduled for the following day. The Confederate States of America had won their first military victory, but at Fort Sumter, both sides had demonstrated that whatever else this conflict might bring, it would be fought by men of courage and conviction. The war that would consume the nation for 4 terrible years had begun with a 36-hour bombardment in which not a single man was killed in action. It was a final moment of civilized warfare before the American Civil War descended into the bloody carnage that would define a generation. April 15, 1861, dawned clear and bright over Charleston Harbor, a stark contrast to the gray clouds that had shrouded Fort Sumter during its final hours of resistance. Major Anderson awoke early, knowing that this would be his last morning as commander of the fortress that had been his responsibility for nearly 4 months. The irony was not lost on him that exactly 86 years earlier, on this same date, American patriots had fought the British at Lexington and Concord. Now Americans prepared to fight Americans. The terms of surrender negotiated the previous day were generous by military standards. Anderson's garrison would be allowed to march out with full military honors, carrying their personal arms and property. Most importantly, they would be permitted to fire a salute to their flag before hauling it down, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their honorable defense of federal property. Throughout the morning, Confederate officials prepared for what they viewed as a historic ceremony. General Beauregard himself planned to attend, along with numerous dignitaries from Charleston and surrounding areas. According to reports published in the Charleston Courier, hundreds of spectators gathered along the waterfront to witness what many believed would be the final act of federal authority in South Carolina. Anderson spent his final hours in the fort, visiting each of his men individually. These soldiers had shared the crucible of bombardment with quiet professionalism, and their commander wanted to ensure that each man understood how proud he was of their conduct. Sergeant Carmody, the Irish veteran who had served with Anderson since Mexico, received particular praise for his steady leadership of the gun crews under impossible conditions. Dr. Crawford reported that Private O'Brien, wounded while attempting to raise the colors during the bombardment's final hours, had regained consciousness and insisted on participating in the departure ceremony. The Irish immigrant's devotion to the flag had become legendary among the garrison, and his fellow soldiers would not consider leaving without him. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the formal surrender ceremony began. Anderson's men formed ranks in the fort's battle-scarred parade ground, their uniforms torn and stained, but their bearing still that of professional soldiers. The American flag that had flown over Fort Sumter throughout the bombardment was carefully folded and prepared for the ceremonial salute. Captain Doubleday, as senior captain, was given the honor of commanding the salute. 50 rounds had been allocated for this purpose, one for each state in the Union that Anderson still hoped could be preserved. The gesture was both defiant and mournful, a final assertion of federal authority before the inevitable surrender. As the first gun fired its salute, spectators on Charleston's waterfront removed their hats in a gesture of respect for fallen adversaries. Confederate officers stood at attention, acknowledging the courage that Anderson's garrison had shown during their desperate defense. Despite political differences that had led to war, professional soldiers on both sides recognized valor when they saw it. The tragedy that would forever mark this ceremony occurred during the 25th round of the salute. Private Daniel Howe, an experienced artillerist who had served faithfully throughout the bombardment, was killed when a cartridge exploded prematurely as the gun was being loaded. Private Edward Galloway was mortally wounded in the same accident and would die several days later. Ironically, the first deaths at Fort Sumter came not from enemy action, but from a tragic accident during the surrender ceremony. The explosion cast a pall over what had been intended as a dignified military ceremony. Dr. Crawford rushed to treat the wounded, while Anderson made the difficult decision to continue with the salute despite the tragedy. These men had died in service to their flag, and that flag deserved the honor they had intended to give it. As reported in Harper's Weekly, the completed salute echoed across Charleston Harbor with solemn dignity. When the final gun had fired, Anderson personally lowered the stars and stripes that had flown over Fort Sumter for 36 hours of bombardment. The flag was carefully folded and presented to him as a memento of the garrison's service. The federal garrison marched out of Fort Sumter with military precision, their heads held high despite their defeat. They boarded the transport vessel Isabel, which would carry them to New York Harbor, and a hero's welcome from Northern civilians who had followed their ordeal through newspaper accounts. Anderson carried with him the flag that had flown over the fort, along with a handful of bricks from the damaged walls as souvenirs. As the Isabel steamed out of Charleston Harbor, Anderson stood on the deck, taking one final look at Fort Sumter. The fortress that had been his home for months now flew the Confederate stars and bars, but the major knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had answered the question of whether the South would fight for independence. Now the question became whether the Union would fight to preserve itself. Confederate forces took formal possession of Fort Sumter within hours of the Federal departure. General Beauregard's soldiers found a fortress that bore testimony to both the intensity of their bombardment and the determination of its defenders. The walls were pocked with shell holes, the buildings were gutted by fire, but the American flag had flown throughout the assault. As evening fell over Charleston Harbor, Confederate engineers began assessing the damage to Fort Sumter and planning its reconstruction as a Southern stronghold. The fortress would indeed become a symbol of Confederate defiance, withstanding Union bombardment for nearly 4 years before finally falling in 1865. But on this April evening in 1861, it represented something else entirely, the point of no return in America's journey toward civil war. The shots fired at Fort Sumter had awakened a sleeping giant. Within weeks, President Lincoln would call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and the Confederacy would expand to include 11 states. The war that began with a bloodless bombardment would consume over 600,000 American lives before peace returned to Charleston Harbor. Major Robert Anderson had witnessed the end of one America and the painful birth of another.